Well, now that we know that the CAPM should work in a particular way, and we've actually used mathematics to prove it to be so, how do we actually apply it? Well, for that, just as with the single index model, remember the single index model is more sort of descriptive, not as rigorously proven, but at bottom they work in just the same way. Just as with the single index model, really what we need to do to calculate expected returns is just we need to know what the risk-free rate is. We need to know what the exposure of our particular individual risk asset to the macro risk factor, in this case now formally shown to be the market portfolio, is, and what the expected return to the market portfolio is as well. If we want to apply this to real data, well, then we just need to say what firm do we want to look at. Let's say we want to look at Dell. What is that firm's exposure to the market portfolio? In other words, what is its beta? Well, we know how to estimate betas from our discussion on the single index model. What is the risk-free rate prevalent in the current environment? And what is the expected return to the market portfolio? And we need to then think about what is the market portfolio. Let's say that for our example, we'll stick with the single index type of thinking and use the S&P 500. Well, given these inputs and just sort of plugging them into this CAPM equation that we proved in the previous slide, we see that the expected return to our individual risk asset to Dell is going to be 16.7%. Remember, this is a forward-looking forecast. In other words, we would expect Dell to give us 16.7% per year. And this makes sense insofar as it looks like Dell is riskier than the market because it has a beta of greater than 1. So therefore, if an investment in the market portfolio should give us an expected return of 14%, and as we've shown with the CAPM, expected returns are proportional to risk, well, now that we're taking more risk than average by investing in a firm that has higher risk than the market portfolio, which would be the average, if that's the situation that obtains, well, then of course the expected return should be higher than average as well. Now, we can also show the CAPM relation graphically by plotting what's called a security market line. And essentially what this shows is if we, instead of plotting returns in mean standard deviation space, we plot them in mean beta space, where beta is now our risk measure. We can say that the expected return to any portfolio is going to be a linear function of its beta. Of course, when beta is 0, the expected return to our portfolio is just the risk-free rate, which makes sense since the risk-free asset by definition has a beta of 0. If our beta is 1, then we have the market portfolio, and therefore our expected return should be the market portfolio. And if we have a beta of anything else, be it a portfolio with a certain beta, an individual asset with a certain beta, or maybe, as we saw with portfolio theory, a combination of the market portfolio with the risk-free rate, where either we're borrowing or we're actually investing at the risk-free rate some portion of our wealth and investing the rest in the market portfolio, falling on this part of the line, or instead borrowing at the risk-free rate and investing more than 100% of our wealth in the market portfolio, being on this part of the line. All of these portfolios, both individual assets and combinations of the market and risk-free rate portfolios, would all fall on the security market line if, and this is an important if the CAPM holds perfectly. In other words, the risk and return of all assets is perfectly proportionally related to their betas. So this introduces an important parameter and a consequence of the CAPM, sort of based on empirical observation. We know that if the CAPM were to be fully correct and there were nothing more to asset pricing than just this proportional relation of expected return to risk as measured by beta, we know that then all securities, all individual assets, all portfolios of assets must lie somewhere on this security market line, the slope representing expected returns to relative to beta. But if we actually plot expected returns, or well, realized returns perhaps as a proxy for expected returns relative to historical betas, we see that there's going to be deviations. There's going to be some stocks that lie above the securities market line. There's going to be some stocks that lie below the securities market line. But of course, as sort of the empirical justification for thinking in terms of this single index model way to begin with, we do expect sort of this positive linear relation between expected returns and market portfolio betas. We just empirically don't observe it to be a perfect one. So we'll see some assets lie above it, some assets lie below it. And we can characterize the departure of each individual asset's expected return from what the securities market line would suggest it should be as this sort of vertical gap, which can be negative for some assets that lie below the securities market line, positive for some assets that lie above it, as the Jensen's alpha, a measure of sort of overpricing or underpricing of individual risk assets. How do we actually know which is which? In other words, which risk asset is overpriced, which is underpriced? Well, an overpriced risk asset would be one that lies below the security market line. So in other words, like this would be an example of a overpriced risk asset, because this one actually earns a lower return than it should. And of course, how does an asset generally go about earning a lower return than it should? Well, if its initial price is higher than it should be. And analogously, an underpriced asset would be one that lies above the security market line, because this, let's say we're talking about this asset, this one offers an expected return that is higher than we would in equilibrium expect it to be, because it's higher than what its beta suggests it should be, if beta is really all that determines asset expected return. So this asset would then be underpriced, because in order to offer this greater expected return than what we should expect in equilibrium, it must have a lower initial price than it would have in equilibrium. So we can measure this alpha as essentially just this difference between the actual return on an arbitrary individual risk asset relative to the expected return on that same risk asset as predicted by our risk model, in this case the CAPM. But of course we can also think about extensions of alpha relative to more complicated risk models, multi-factor models, the sort of which we'll talk about toward the end of this lecture. And therefore this sort of idea of alpha as a measure of abnormal positive performance is one that's actually well used beyond just the CAPM. Really, it's a measure of whatever your expected return model is. Does your individual risk asset or portfolio of risk assets offer you a return that is higher than what your model would suggest your expected return should be? So, for example, an active manager will often say that they can construct a portfolio that has alpha. Not necessarily just relative to the CAPM, relative to perhaps more complicated risk models. and therefore expected return models, but essentially one that earns more return than it should. Let's go back to our example of Dell. Let's say that we know that the expected return to Dell according to the CAPM was 16.7% per year. Let's say that the actual return to Dell is about 18% per year. Well, then that means that Dell is one of these stocks above the security market line. It is underpriced because it actually returns a greater amount than it should in equilibrium. Therefore, its price is below that of what its equilibrium price should be. And what is the alpha of Dell then? Well, it's just the difference between the expected return according to the CAPM, which would be on the SML here, and the realized return that we observe to be 18% there. 18% minus 16.7% is 1.3%. So being above the security market line, this particular risk asset would be underpriced. And indeed, of course, this is true for any asset that has positive alpha. So if we look at, let's say, Apple, that happens to have an expected return above what the CAPM would suggest it should be, this would be the alpha of Apple. And any asset that is above the SML would have a positive alpha and would therefore be underpriced. And every asset below the SML that would have a negative alpha would be underpriced. Remember, the security market line is drawn not in mean variance space, though. It's drawn in mean return beta space. So what is alpha? Well, as we were saying, especially with this application to active manager evaluation, alpha is essentially a measure of performance. If the CAPM or any other model of expected returns and risk is the correct asset pricing model, remember all asset pricing models are essentially models of expected return and risk, assuming we have the correct one, we just by definition would want to invest in assets that have as high alpha as possible, and we would not want to invest in any assets with negative alpha. In other words, alpha is essentially our measure of risk-adjusted performance because we know what the expected return, given how much risk you take, is. And if you get more expected return than your fair share, so to speak, that means you have superior risk-adjusted performance. If you have less, a negative alpha, you have inferior risk-adjusted performance. But this approach comes with a couple important caveats. And indeed, this sort of idea of claiming to have positive alpha, as a lot of active managers do, is particularly susceptible to these caveats. First of all, are we actually using the correct asset pricing model? In other words, is a CAPM alpha or a 3-factor alpha or an n-factor alpha really the right model for determining expected risk based on the amount of, expected return based on the amount of risk you take? Well, that depends on the amount or on the types of risk that you're actually taking. In other words, one can come up with maybe an exotic derivative strategy that actually doesn't take any market risk. And so, of course, it would have a positive alpha relative to the CAPM. But that doesn't necessarily mean that that strategy is a good one because, for example, it might have really high exposure to volatility. And if you were to sort of go into it just based on a positive CAPM alpha, you might find yourself facing tremendous losses in other economic environments, not where the market necessarily falls, but one perhaps where volatility rises. So in other words, for alpha to accurately measure investment performance, it must actually be an alpha relative to a model that is appropriate to the type of risk that the investment in question actually takes. But, for example, for the CAPM, it would be probably the right model to take to evaluate assets that are only exposed to market risk. The problem is that it's somewhat hard to find assets that are only exposed to market risk, and that's sort of one of the reasons why, as we will discuss later in this lecture, so many other risk factors have been proposed in addition to this single index market risk model of the CAPM. And the other sort of more pedestrian caveat for the CAPM is simply that even if it's the right model and your risk asset really is only exposed to market risk, you might still not estimate your asset beta and expected market return correctly. And therefore, then, even if you're using the right model, you might just not be giving it the right inputs in order to get the right alpha. So there's two important caveats to keep in mind when actually evaluating alpha as a measure of performance: whether the risk model is actually right, and whether the inputs to the model are actually estimated correctly.